Hey everyone, Eric Rennie here, and welcome to the 137th episode of the Writ podcast. I was expecting to do a bit of a calmer year-ender look at how things went over the last year, but instead we're going to have to focus on just what's happened over the last few days. So joining me to do that is the CBC's Aaron Wherry and Stephanie Levitz of the Globe and Mail. Hello.
Hello.
Hey.
So how did we get here? Stephanie, how did this happen? How is it that on Friday, we were expecting a fall economic statement. The House would adjourn on Tuesday, and it would be just a quiet kind of move over to the holidays. And instead, it's been quite a few days.
I mean, the short answer of how we got here is that the Prime Minister tried to tell the then Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland that she wasn't going to have her job anymore. But before he moved her out, he wanted her to stand up and deliver the fall economic statement. And then once she was done with that, he would shuffle her off to a newly created portfolio dealing with Canada-U.S. relations. She said no, and then politically stabbed him in the most spectacular of fashions, quitting just hours before she was to deliver that very statement. So that is where we find ourselves today. How we got here in the first place is, I think the healthy tension that often exists between a finance minister and a prime minister that ought to exist. At some point, the two no longer being of like mind as situations changed and evolved, and a certain tension point where someone who had been one of the Prime Minister's most loyal defenders took a look at the landscape and said, I might be, I'm sticking my neck out for you on a daily basis, and you're not doing the same for me, and from my perspective, you're not doing the same for the country either.
Aaron, why didn't you see this coming?
Why didn't I personally see this coming? I mean, clearly I was slacking off and complacency had set in. To a certain extent, there is a bit of a pattern now here, right? Where this Prime Minister, for whatever his gifts with the public, whatever his ability to connect with people, whatever the empathy and emotional intelligence that he seems to have or has been sort of reputed to have had, his ability his sort of working relationships internally, though, don't seem to be as strong, and his ability to read the room doesn't seem to be as strong. Steph's right about everything that led up to this, but I sort of can't get past the decision to call Chrystia Freeland on Friday, apparently by Zoom, and present this idea to her, seemingly, one assumes with the assumption that she was going to say, yes, that's a great idea, let's do it. And then to not, it's hard to know exactly how that conversation goes, but I'm left wondering how it ended and what the thinking was within the PMO over the weekend that led them to not realize that on Monday morning she was going to tell them she was resigning. The decision to call her and make that pitch 3 days before she presents the fall economic statement is sort of mind-boggling. If you on a pure sort of cold calculus, you can sort of understand if they'd called her on Wednesday morning or Tuesday morning and said, hey, thanks for that fall economic statement, but now we're thinking of making a change. But calling her 72 hours before the fall economic statement and saying, hey, go do the fall economic statement, but like the next day or 2 days after that, we're going to move you. It seems to have opened them up to such a risk that she was going to say no, and she wasn't going to take that well. And then the whole thing seems to have fallen apart. Each of the kind of falling outs that the Prime Minister has had with different ministers there are unique characteristics to it, each of them, but it is remarkable how badly there have been these fallings out now repeatedly, right? The Jody Wilson-Raybould situation is unique in its own respect for a number of reasons, but it's the same, in the broad outlines, it's the same sort of thing of you have this minister who you've put in a big position, who is celebrated for being in that position, and then you try to move them and it blows up in your face, and you seem to have not sort of handled it in a way where maybe all ministers eventually get moved, but if you're going to move a minister that's that important, you better be sure it doesn't blow up in your face. And again, it's blown up in their face. And I think it's just a remarkable part of sort of the story of this government and this Prime Minister's time in office, of just how often this has happened now, that these blow-ups have happened, and it has ended so badly.
Yeah, Steph, it doesn't feel like this is as much a politics story. It's a weird human story. It is mind-boggling, as Aaron says, that this meeting could have happened, and not even in a political cabinet or in the PMO, in an office, in a business, that you would ask that kind of, make that kind of request and expect it to go well. It is really puzzling just from a human aspect how that could have even played out.
I think that's it. I mean, and I think also, that meeting, it was the culmination of months of things, right? Like, let's not forget that tensions, between Freeland as finance minister and the Prime Minister probably go all the way back to last year's budget, and some arguing there about what ought to be in there and what not ought to be in there. Then you fast forward to the summer and you first start hearing these stories about Mark Carney, and Chrystia Freeland is out there defending Trudeau at every turn. He is not doing the same thing, right? There's bits and pieces along the way that maybe if that relationship had been stronger on a different level, you could have that conversation on Friday, because you'd been laying the groundwork for that conversation, right? In this instance, you have to wonder if there was no groundwork laid for this conversation, which, for example, let's say, as we've reported, right, that the offer for Chrystia Freeland was this Canada-U.S. relations portfolio. She wasn't invited to Mar-a-Lago for the big tete-a-tete with the Prime Minister and Donald Trump soon after his election. So if you were serious about wanting her to take that job, you really believed that this was a good idea and she was the person to steer this ship forward, how come she wasn't in Mar-a-Lago? And it's interesting, Chrystia Freeland, for the better part of a year, had been doing these press conferences on Parliament Hill. They referred to them as the Tuesday Spectaculars, or Team Tuesday, or they had cute names for them, the Liberals. But the point was that they were coming out, this was part of their comms plan, that they weren't doing a good enough job communicating to Canadians everything that they do for the economy. So they decided to start doing these Tuesday news conferences to make announcements or set the agenda, and obviously always they would take questions, a bit of a dog and a pony show. I'm telling you all of this because Chrystia Freeland had gained a reputation, in these press conferences for never really saying anything. It was very difficult to get her to cleanly and clearly answer a question. But at what might have actually been the last one of these, come to think of it, she was asked, "Why weren't you at Mar-a-Lago?" And you could tell, a flush of red sort of crept up her neck and into her cheeks, and she kind of, well, you're going to have to ask the Prime Minister that. And it was not a typical Chrystia Freeland response, right? Which suggests that, there was some wondering, perhaps, why wasn't I in Mar-a-Lago? And so my point here being is that if this job was meant to be a serious offer, if it was actually considered a serious portfolio by the government, that maybe the groundwork for doing that, she would have been involved in the groundwork for laying that, right? Having a discussion with her, bringing her along. What do you think about this? And oh, by the way, we think we're going to make Mark Carney the Prime Minister, as the Finance Minister rather, as the Globe and Mail reported, right? If you wanted to mitigate the risk that this was going to blow up spectacularly in your face, you would probably have, say, Freeland, Carney, and the Prime Minister all in a room, collectively hashing out what this could possibly look like and how it was going to work.
Yeah, and it's not really clear to me, and maybe Steph, the reporting has said it, but not from what I've seen or heard. It doesn't seem like it was absolutely 100% locked in that Mark Carney was going to take over, right? So, Aaron, it brings up the question again of what was the intent here? What was the plan? What was the rush? What was the need to do this a few days before the adjournment of the House? If they did this in January 15th, I feel this might have gone a bit better and would have had about the same impact as if they had managed to pull this off today, which is when it would have been.
Yeah, it's hard to... I mean, look, I can build an argument for why you would want to move Chrystia Freeland out of finance at this moment. As skillfully as that letter was written the other day, she was not always the best communicator. In one of... I can't remember whether it was the last of those of those Tuesday news conferences, or maybe the second last. And she was asked to defend the GST cut and the checks, and she, said, well, we're trying to deal with the vibe session, and, that went over like lead balloon, and she's had moments like that in the past. The sort of famous comment about canceling her family's Disney Plus subscription. She was not, except for a few moments, she wasn't necessarily thriving in the House during question period, and those fights over fiscal and economic policy, she wasn't maybe the right voice to have leading, sort of the government's main sort of finance and economic spokesperson at a moment like this. And, you could look at even Dom LeBlanc's sort of, impromptu news conference the other day as finance minister and say, oh, okay, that's a guy whose voice is better at this job right now. And you can also build an argument for why you wouldn't have taken her to Mar-a-Lago. Not only because, the relationship, Donald Trump's attitude toward her doesn't, he's not a fan, let's put it that way. And Dom LeBlanc is a good guy in those settings, right, around a table, glad handing. But as Steph says, if you're going to make the move, and this is your deputy prime minister, and this is the sort of the first, the original Trudeau Liberal, and the person who has been so integral to your government, and who, as it was explained to me, days before she resigned, she has been loyal to him, and he's supposedly a big fan of hers. So why wasn't she brought along on this decision? How does it possibly end this badly and this suddenly and this unexpectedly? It's really hard to imagine how you get to that call on Friday, and it's even harder to imagine like how that call ended and how you go through the next 2 days without some kind of attempt to fix the situation. And to not seemingly have Mark Carney in your back pocket to pull out and immediately put in as finance minister. I'm guessing and speculating, but I assume that if Carney was even close to going in, there was some thought that moving Freeland was part of the deal to bring him in. But again, how it seems like such a gamble to, well, we're going to call Chrystia Freeland and we're going to try to get her to move, and then hopefully that'll bring in Carney. It's really hard to see how this was supposed to work and who thought it was going to work.
All right, well, let's cast our eyes a little bit forward then, since we don't have all the answers of how this could have possibly unfolded. But what are the Prime Minister's options here? They all seem to be bad options, and it's not clear which one he'll choose. Steph, what's the next move that he's going to do? Or what could he do?
There's so many things he could do, right? He could go to the Governor General and say that he needs a new mandate to govern and ask her to dissolve Parliament and call an election. He could prorogue the House of Commons, in January, let's say, for a day, come back with a speech from the throne and effectively dare Jagmeet Singh to bring him down at this exact moment in time. It's not clear that Jagmeet Singh would. He could hang on and hope to placate the restive backbenches with something. He could say, I'm stepping down as leader of the Liberal Party, and I'm going to trigger, and we are going to have a leadership race, and we will call an election as soon as the next leader is chosen. Or we could call, we're still planning for an election in October 2025. I don't think that's viable. There will be chances for the opposition to vote him down, probably, February, March-ish, through opposition days, not on a confidence vote. So, yeah, there's a ton of things there. And then, you have to, setting aside sort of all of the different options, you have to throw Donald Trump into the mix and these tariffs. And what happens, how do those political options shift or change if either A, Trump does not, in fact, impose those tariffs on day one of his presidency and manages to say, okay, I'm not going to do it, I've struck a deal with Canada, yada, yada, yada. Or B, he actually does impose them. Because, I think all of those scenarios are sort of hinging potentially on what happens on January the 20th. And that's absent, I should say, any further revolt from inside the Liberal caucus, any critical mass of MPs putting their names public to his resignation, any more cabinet ministers just saying, to hell with this, and publicly saying, I'm out of here. Not with all due respect to Housing Minister Sean Fraser, who I know's family situation is very real, and him saying, I'm not running again, I want to spend more time with my family. Often that's a euphemism for something, And so if we have a bunch of MPs and cabinet ministers who go home in the next week to their families, take a look around and say, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. If there's a critical mass there, it might force Justin Trudeau's hand one way or the other.
Yeah, Aaron, the timing is no longer kind of viable in any good way for the Liberals to plan out. Even if they dissolved the legislature today, went to the Governor General, the election would still take place after Trump is sworn in, and you'd have a prime minister coming in. If it was a change of prime minister, maybe 2 weeks after that. The House is scheduled to come back a week after the swearing in. If there is a confidence motion of some kind, the government would likely fall in February or March. So we're, again, talking a long time. A leadership race would straddle this timeline, and there's it just seems like all of the off-ramps that Trudeau might have had that would have been the best options for his party, let alone for the country, have passed months ago.
Yeah. The first off-ramp was after Toronto St. Paul's. And not taking that off-ramp was essentially a gamble that it wouldn't get worse. And that that Trudeau could piece it back together and hang on. And I guess, we weren't even at that point thinking of what would happen if Donald Trump became president again. He didn't take that off-ramp. It didn't get better. In fact, it's only gotten a lot worse. And now you're stuck in a situation where, as you say, it's really hard to imagine a scenario in which Justin Trudeau is not the prime minister when Donald Trump gets inaugurated. It's really now down to sort of how things proceed from there. You could imagine a scenario where, he announces his intention to resign as soon as a new leader a new Liberal leader is selected, and then encourages the Liberal Party to put together some kind of relatively short leadership race. And then a new prime minister, comes back with a throne speech. This gets a bit complicated. Presumably Trudeau, if he calls a leadership race, or if he announces his intention to resign, would then prorogue Parliament. So a new leader comes back with a throne speech and maybe a budget, and maybe lasts a couple months at most, and then we go into a new election with a new Liberal leader. That hanging over all of that will be the tariff threat, but it's hard to know. It's really hard to envision a scenario where if the tariff comes in on day one of a Trump presidency, that Justin Trudeau isn't the prime minister trying to deal with that. And that's not, look, it's not suboptimal. I don't think it's like catastrophic, unsurvivable. The country won't fall apart, but it's not great. And that's just sort of the end result of not taking, as you say, those off ramps that he had in the last 6 months of 2024. And so it's really hard to see how this plays out now. I mean, I assume he is, to some extent, considering whether he wants to try to hang on, and then trying to figure out whether that's even possible. Because as Steph says, we can't assume that there aren't other cabinet ministers who are going to bail, that there aren't more caucus members who are going to say they want him to go. The lesson of the last 6 months is if you think it can't get worse, you're wrong. It can get worse. So he's got to figure out whether it's survivable and then whether he wants to continue to fight. And if he doesn't, then he's got to probably make a decision pretty quickly. Maybe he doesn't need to make it this week, but he's got to make it, pretty early in January, because the country's got to kind of move on.
The caucus didn't really revolt enough after Toronto St. Paul's to put any real pressure on him. They sort of kind of mildly did after La Salle et Mont Verdun. This time it feels like if they don't do it now, they're never going to do it, right? So his speeches that he made at the Laurier Club event, at the Holiday Caucus, they weren't the speeches of someone who is absolutely resigning in the next couple of days. But he didn't also say anything like, I will be leading you into the next election and all that. So, Steph, is this survivable for him to stay on if he wants to? Like, is that even a legitimate option for him, really?
I mean, as everyone will say, all options remain on the table, right? Ultimately, it is only, not only, the three ways, I suppose, he leaves, right? He quits because the pressure from caucus becomes publicly unsurvivable, which is, there is some critical mass. And the thing about the critical mass, though, is even if you ask the MPs who've put their names out there, who have said, I really think he should resign, and then you say, okay, well, what are you prepared to do about that? There isn't an answer, which is to say, yes, they do not have the legislative mechanism within caucus that they could draw upon to vote him out, but they could do all sorts of other things. They could vote non-confidence in him. There are vague other ways, I suppose, that they could exert some matter of leverage to say, if you don't leave, we're going to stop vote. We're going to vote against you on bills. We're going to this, we're going to that. They're not doing any of that right now. And it's not even clear that they're discussing doing any of that right now. So, okay, so let's say he doesn't have that. So he could leave by calling an election. He could say, all right, I'm just going to go down with the ship. And maybe that's the best thing for both the country. Like, an election is the best thing for the country because in his, we need a mandate on Trump that's important. Recognizing hopefully that, if his party loses, they just lose and that's the end of it. There's, I think, a version of this story where that's the cleanest exit. Like, the cleanest way to do this is to say, I built this, so I will take it to the people one more time and I will lose, and that might destroy my party, but I built the party. The way the party is now is my party, as Aaron, has so skillfully written about in the past. And to just put a new leader on top of, I think it was like Blanchet who basically said, the other day, the Bloc Québécois leader, if Trudeau were to resign now and say, I'm not going to be leader anymore, well, let's have a new leader, that doesn't ideologically shift the government. That doesn't change necessarily anything. It just puts a new person in charge. And in the context of Trump, is that the thing we need? If Trudeau could go in 2021 and bring down the minority government and ask for an election because he didn't have a mandate post-COVID, which was the ostensible argument there, I think Trump is grounds to say to the Canadian people, we need a new mandate. Even if he knows he's not going to win one, it's just clean. It's a clean fight. My vision, the other guy's vision, you pick, Canadians. This isn't about me. That's a hard argument maybe for him to sell, but it seems like the cleanest exit.
It would be rather self-sacrificial, if he does decide that he could resign and get someone else in, they're also probably going to lose the next election, but at least on paper, it gives them a chance, whereas with him there, it doesn't give him a chance.
Sure, but think about it from the context of dealing with Trump. So then you're going to call a leadership race, and all of your heavy hitters in cabinet are now preoccupied with their own political survivability. Like, if we just game out the people who've said they think they want to run, that your foreign affairs minister, your industry innovation minister, potentially the secretary of the Treasury Board, these are not minor portfolios. They would all have to go. And with ultimate respect, I'm sure there's very capable backbenchers who could step up. All of them are going to want to align behind someone or another. It's going to cause a problem. Like, I just don't know how you, in this particular context, the off-ramp for this move was pre-Trump. Now, we're going to have a caretaker government run by the clerk of the Privy Council to negotiate tariffs with Donald Trump. I mean, that sounds awfully risky. But hey, anything is possible right now.
Better is always possible.
It was worse.
Or worse. Worse is also possible. What's interesting to me, it's obviously first on Trudeau to decide whether he wants to leave, at least if you look back at the last 6 months. But I am struck by the fact that, caucus and cabinet could have forced his hand. They could have pushed him out. Yes, there's no formal mechanism. They didn't adopt the Reform Act, yada, yada, yada. But we all know that enough political pressure, enough people, as we've just seen in the last 72 hours, if someone comes out and says, I'm quitting, it can do serious damage and force the Prime Minister's hand, potentially. The fact that they didn't do that, especially caucus, leads me to believe that there just isn't sufficient enthusiasm for any of the successors. If there had been a hankering or a critical mass of MPs who were really eager for one candidate or another, I imagine he would have been pushed out by now. And so when it comes to the election scenario, I mean, I think, look, Steph's argument makes a lot of sense. The question I have about it is, would liberals be okay with that? Would liberals say, yeah, let's just let Trudeau take this one for the team and we'll move on after that? Or would they say, whoa, we would like someone else to lead us into this election? And I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. Because right up until now, they haven't in their actions shown a sufficient hankering for somebody else. And so now would they think bringing in Freeland, who, let's be honest, has probably improved her public favorables pretty significantly in the last couple days, would they want her to lead them into the next election? Would they, it is clean from the sort of Trudeau perspective of like, let's just get this election over with. But I guess my question is, would liberals be okay with that? Would they say, yeah, let's let Trudeau lead us in, get this election over with, and then we'll rebuild? Or would they say, no, hold on. It'll be an absolute disaster if Trudeau leads us into this election. It will be something less than that disaster if, insert party leader here leads us into the next election.
Just on that quickly, I mean, as mentioned before, the communications kind of difficulties that Freeland had in the past haven't changed. She can write a very withering letter, but you can't campaign by letter writing. And Carney seems to have been almost fatally tarnished by the last few days. You wonder if he can actually make a comeback and make a bid for the leadership if he's seen as someone who contributed to Freeland being knifed in this way. So Steph, like, how has the last couple of days changed both of their potential candidacies to replace Trudeau?
I'm not sure that Chrystia Freeland was ever going to try and replace Justin Trudeau. Like, I don't know that was, her name was in the mix and then it wasn't, and there was no obvious sign that she was organizing in any capacity other than, sort of being the finance minister and the deputy prime minister, which you could say is audition enough. With Mark Carney, what's interesting, I mean, there's lots of semi-interesting things here about Mark Carney, but in the last 72 hours, or maybe even since July, Mark Carney hasn't been very clear about what Mark Carney wants to do. Even with all of this reporting in the last couple of days about this thing and that thing, he has not commented publicly. And so does he want to be associated with all of this? Does he not want to be associated with all of this? What role does he play in this mega drama? You know what I mean? Is he the kid caught in the middle of two parents who've just divorced and he can't figure out which one to go live with? Like, is it that kind of analogy? Is it, I don't know. It feels sometimes too that Mark Carney became not a straw man. That's not quite the, like, who thinks it's a good idea for Mark Carney except for Mark Carney? And Justin Trudeau,
and Justin Trudeau.
I guess I'm asking, like, where is the critical mass behind Mark Carney? Like, you can sort of see Melanie Joly has a contingent of people that make a case for her, and you have a contingent of people making a case for Champagne. Once upon a time, there was a case being made for Anand. You were clearly hearing more about Sean Fraser. Absent a particular subset of liberals, that Mark Carney, it hung in the ether, but it was really unclear about why and what place does he occupy in the political firmament. And I think that still remains a bit ambiguous. So I don't know if he's tarnished in all of this per se. It's a question of why would you want right now to go work for Justin Trudeau would be the best question, as opposed to what do you think you can do when you get here.
Yeah. Aaron, I don't know if you have anything to add about that.
Yeah, I mean, I understand the argument for Mark Carney on paper as a sort of respected economic voice, someone who's occupied very senior high offices in two countries. You can obviously see why you would want him, if you're Justin Trudeau, to be finance minister. you can sort of wrap your head around the idea that if the Liberal Party wanted to move in a slightly more centrist, serious, quote unquote, direction, bringing in Mark Carney might make sense as leader, as a sort of as a break from the Trudeau era. The question I have is, I guess my bias is after I've heard that someone has been speculated as getting into politics and the moment has passed once or twice, I just start to wonder whether you really want to be in politics, and whether this is a real thing. Like, how much do you really want to do this? Because there are all sorts of cases, I think Frank McKenna is sort of the patron saint of this, of people saying like, oh, that guy's going to get in, that guy's going to get in, he's a leadership contender, and then opportunities pass, and it just never happens. And so I just don't know under what conditions Mark Carney is willing to get in and how much he really wants it, I guess. It's just not clear to me, based on sort of the speculation that has come and gone so many times now about Mark Carney. It's hard to know what's real at this point. And at this point, would he, from Mark Carney's perspective, I guess, let's say do you want to jump in and run as leader right now for the Liberal Party and try to lead them into the next election? Is there a path to victory for any Liberal leader right now? And if there isn't, are you willing to spend some years in opposition? Or would this just be a kind of, a brief run as Prime Minister for a few months and then you move on? It's hard to sort of game all that out. And it goes back to, what do Liberals want to do here? Do they think there's a path, and who wants that job right now?
All right, we'll close on this. You've both been covering things on the Hill for a long time. How does this rank in terms of kind of a craziness of a political events that you've witnessed on the Hill? Aaron, how does this rank for you?
I mean, I'm not that old, Eric. But the only thing I can compare it to is the so-called coalition crisis in 2008, when, if I remember it correctly, there was, a good 72 hours there where it wasn't clear who was going to be Prime Minister and whether the government was going to survive and whether Stéphane Dion was suddenly going to be Prime Minister or not, and so on and so forth. It's so unexpected. It was so unexpected. It was such a, as I tried to kind of write this week, Chrystia Freeland is so integral to what the Trudeau government has done over the last 9 years. The idea that she would quit on the morning of the fall economic statement in a public letter that eviscerated the Prime Minister, it's just stunning. And, if there's one thing you can say about Justin Trudeau, is that his time in office and his time in politics has very rarely been subtle, and it's very rarely been uneventful. And there's always been something interesting going on. And this just feels like, an ending, if it is that sort of fits with what has been a fairly dramatic time in office.
Yeah, what's the proverb? May you live in interesting times. It's actually a curse. But Steph, how does this rank for you so far?
The coalition crisis is where my head was too. But just in terms of the raw political dynamic of it, it would be, the week that led to Aaron O'Toole being absolutely defenestrated as Conservative Party leader. In terms of, it was bubbling along. It would flare up a little bit. The people were mad. It would go away. You had, a senator gets kicked out of his caucus, a rank and file. There's little bits. And then all of a sudden, in what felt like the space of 48 hours, there was a critical mass throwing knives at him in public. He was scrambling around, trying to save it, making all sorts of promises, saying he would do this, saying he would do that. Oh, I'll be better. Oh, I promise. And it was just over. And sort of once that train had left the station, there was no stopping it. That, in terms of the frenzied energy on the Hill in the last couple of days, that's kind of what it reminded me of. Like, no one quite knew what was going to happen next. But in that instance, there kind of was a clear end. We are going to use the Reform Act and we are going to vote you out. This one doesn't have that. Like, for all of the reasons we've just spent, almost 40 minutes talking about, there are so many scenarios and so many different variables. And in perhaps a stroke of dumb luck, shall we say, that this all happened now when the House of Commons has gone home. Because if you imagine this having happened even like 3 weeks ago, when everyone is still here and they can feed off each other and feed off the anger and feed off the energy, there's an element of that has now been removed from that situation. The drama of this place, the bubble that it is. And now all of the MPs, the dissidents, the supporters, they've all gone back into their ridings. They're going to take a deep breath, hang with their families, be in their communities, and whether they maintain the dissidents and all of that stuff, I mean, maybe everybody just needed a super big timeout, and let's wait to see what happens on January the 20th, when the president's inaugurated.
Maybe it'll be a quiet few days, but I have some doubts that we're going to get much of a break over the next few weeks. So I appreciate both of you taking some time out to speak with me today.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Eric.